artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello and welcome to episode 273. I'm talking with Megan Peters, an associate professor in the UC Irvine Department of Cognitive Sciences, who thinks about thinking, or metacognition. She researches how the brain represents and uses uncertainty, focusing on how these abilities support metacognitive evaluations of the quality of our decisions. She's a fellow in each of the UCI Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, the UCI Center for Theoretical Behavioral Sciences, and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, or CIFAR. She's also president and co-founder of NeuroMatch, an educational platform serving over 30,000 students in over 120 countries across computational neurosciences, deep learning, computational climate science, and neuro-AI. Last week, we talked about how we build models of the world, how language shapes our thinking, whether AI is doing metacognition in its chains of thought, statistical learning in AIs and humans, consciousness in humans and animals and AIs, and theories of consciousness. This week, we'll talk about Turing Tests, measuring the brain, the haunted mansion, some cool experiments on brains, and cats. A bit of Latin, that'll come up, that I had to Google. Modus ponens, modus tollens are two rules of inference in logic, so they're old enough to have Latin names. Modus ponens means that if P implies Q and P is true, then Q is true. Straightforward enough. Modus tollens means that if P implies Q and Q is false, then P is false. As an example, if the assertion is that if it is raining, then the ground is wet, there's the P and the Q, and we know it's raining, P is true, therefore the ground is wet. Q is true. That's modus ponens. If, on the other hand, the ground is not wet, that means Q is not true, then we know it's not raining. P is not true. That's modus tollens. And now let's get back to the interview with Megan Peters. Do you have a goal of being able to construct a test for consciousness in some system or entity?
That would be great. I think that's a really hard problem. And I contributed to another paper last year with some of the other folks in the CIFAR Brain Mind Consciousness group, where we talk about the challenge of creating a test or set of tests for consciousness. And the problem is that not all of them are substrate neutral. Anything that we've validated in us as a test for consciousness, it's been only validated in us. So an example is like the sniff test. Is this one that you are aware of? So just for everybody's edification, the sniff test is if you're in a coma and I want to test whether someone's in there, whether you're actually awake and locked in or whether you're unconscious in a vegetative state, one of the tests that I can do is to hold an odor under your nose. And if it's a nice odor, your behavior is going to be different than if it's a nasty odor. So if it's the smell of a rose, you might demonstrate like a larger inhale. And if it's the smell of rotten fish, you will exhibit different behavior if you can actually phenomenally experience that smell. That test maybe is great from a bedside perspective. It's a great clinical indicator. It depends on having a nose. And it depends on subjectively experiencing a rose as more pleasant than rotten fish. And if you're a dog, you might not have those preferences. So, these tests are really hard to design and to validate on populations that are not us. So the point then is, yeah, it would be great to have a test or set of tests for consciousness in any system for ethical reasons, for clinically relevant reasons. In us, this is huge. For ethical reasons in non-human animals, this would be really important. Is it okay to do experiments not under anesthesia in this case? And for artificial systems, hugely impactful. The Turing test is not going to cut it. We need to know. But designing those is really difficult. And if we get it wrong in either direction, false positives or false negatives, we're in real trouble, I think.
And thank you for bringing up Turing Test. That was going to be my next question, because that is kind of like the mother of all behaviorist tests to determine some kind of internal quality, like consciousness or intelligence, because Turing seemed to feel that anything that depended upon the structure of it, or something equally or even more unmeasurable, like spiritual qualities, was not scientific. And so it would have to boil down to something that you could tell from the outside. And this is not so hypothetical, purely philosophical, because at some point a court might be asked to decide whether a given entity is conscious. That's happened with people. That has happened with other biological entities. And at some point it will happen with an AI. And then we need a way of persuading the court as to whether this thing is conscious. Do you think that your research offers a hope of providing an answer?
You're asking really great questions. Yeah, I think the attractiveness, the seduction of an objective behavioral marker is really powerful. That it's very clear why we would want to have something like that. And the problem is that consciousness, by definition, is the thing that's not observable by an external entity. And so you have to have these kind of indicators or markers of consciousness. And then you get into this problem of, is the system that I'm doing this test in capable of exhibiting that marker? Even if there is someone in there, if I build an artificial system that doesn't have a nose, it's not going to show the behavior that I want from the sniff test. I think that the path forward here is to have behavior be one piece of the puzzle, but only one piece. So there's a lot of insights, I think, from this paper that say, let's open the box, let's peer under the hood and see not only the behavior of the system, but how it's producing that behavior. What are the underlying computations? What are the underlying representations that are happening? Are those in line with us as we know it, or with other systems that we presume to be conscious, like great apes or similar? And I think that this is the right path to start down, in the sense that, let's say that we create a system and we show that not only does it behave like us, it passes the Turing test. We've got systems that pass the Turing test at this point anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But not only does it behave like us in passing the Turing test, it also behaves like us in doing other things, like if you embed it in a vehicle, it makes the same kind of moral choices that we would. It doesn't make mistakes in terms of getting confused about visual inputs. It behaves like us. And then we peer under the hood and we say, oh, look, it thinks like us too. It has like these same kinds of computational architectures. It has these same kinds of internal representations. The way that the embedding, the low-dimensional internal representation of a cat versus a dog, those are more similar than a cat versus an octopus. And because it has this same similarity space under the hood, then maybe we can say it represents things kind of like we do. So it ticks a lot of these boxes. That's great. Maybe it has a higher probability of being conscious as a result. That's wonderful. The problem is that that's like a positive test. And just because it doesn't exhibit all those things doesn't mean that it isn't conscious too. So like your internal representations might be quite similar to mine, but might be very different from those of your house cat. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your house cat has no consciousness at all, just because its internal representations and architectures or computations are not the same as yours. So I think it's a good start, like observable things. Yeah. Behavior is one. Ways of processing information is another one. And those have to be tools in our toolkit, but we've still got a long way to go to develop more tools.
And regardless of the outcome of any tests performed, I'm going to relate to our cats as though they're conscious, because that's why we have them. You've talked about looking under the hood. And if we apply the theory to human beings to see if it works for determining consciousness in them, what does looking under the hood look like? Are we talking like fMRIs or dissection? What?
All of the above. It would be a combination of invasive neuroscience, non-invasive neuroscience. So yeah, open the head and stick electrodes all over the brain and see what's happening. Or don't open the head and stick electrodes on the outside of the skull and see what's happening. Put someone in an fMRI, look at where the blood is going. The timing there is, not great. You get a picture of the brain every 2 seconds or so. And so like the brain works a lot faster than that. But you can still see where the blood is going and what kinds of representations are happening. I think behavior is a big tool here also. Cleverly designed experiments that isolate the kind of cognitive capacities that we think are indicative of the underlying processes that might give rise to consciousness. So functions associated with consciousness is a kind of key term that if for those interested, you might go looking for papers that say these things, that these are when you have consciousness, like we are conscious in theory, here are a lot of other things that tend to go along with that hand in hand from a behavior or like cognitive capacity perspective. So there's things that we might be able to do when we are conscious of information, and we can't do those things when we are not conscious at all or when we're not conscious of the information that is relevant. And so compositional reasoning might be one of them, depending on who you are. Certain depth of processing semantically might be another one, although there's other indications that sometimes you can do surprising amounts of stuff without being consciously aware of that information. So all of those, I think, are approaches where we can look under the hood. But sometimes looking under the hood is from a theory and like conceptual space rather than a physical open the brain and look at what's inside. And that's where the computational modeling kind of comes in as well, because it's meant to build these high level kind of abstract descriptions of how the brain is working without needing to do any neuroimaging at all.
There's so much here. I can see why you spend your life on this. And you mentioned visual science earlier as being one of your particular interests. And that reminded me of how Roman Yampolsky said some time ago, he proposed a test for whether something is an AI or not. And he actually did this prior to ChatGPT and other visual models of showing it an optical illusion. And if it doesn't see the illusion that the way we do, then it's an AI. If you show it this picture and it's one of those ones where the one bar looks longer than the other and they're the same size, or one patch looks darker than the other and they're the same intensity, or it looks like it's throbbing in some way and it's not moving at all. And my interpretation of that behavior is that our visual system had to do a lot with relatively limited hardware, and so it evolved shortcuts to make sense of the world that we have to navigate, which doesn't include weird abstract images. Does that processing, would an AI need to be able to see the optical illusion the way that we do before we decided that it was conscious?
I don't think so at all.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think the other way around is a prime example of why optical illusions or just kind of visual processing in general is not sufficient for answering these questions. So a lot of visual illusions are the result of, or are thought to be the result of actually an optimal process, optimal meaning the best that a system could ever do under the circumstances. So like mathematical God under the constraints, right, of the noise that's present in the input. And so it's been shown time and again that a lot of these visual illusions are actually the result of the brain solving an under-constrained, difficult visual transformation problem in the best way that any system could possibly solve that. So some of my favorite examples of this are, for any users out or any listeners out here who have ever been to Disneyland. I live in Southern California, so I like to make this reference. And you've ever gone to Disneyland and you go to the Haunted Mansion and you're walking towards the carts that take you through the ride. And along the pathway to get into the little cars, there are these busts, these kind of shoulders and head busts that appear to follow you. And it's very creepy. And the way that Disney creates these illusions is that it's actually not a convex bust of a shoulders and head of some guy. It's actually concave and it's lit from below. And your brain just refuses to see that as a concave face lit from below. And this is because of two things that are built into how your visual system processes information due to your experience and maybe even due to hardwiring. One of them is we expect light to come from above. Look around you right now and look at where the light source is. It's probably more likely to be above eye line than below eye line. And the second one is, how often do you ever see concave faces in the real world, right? You don't. You never do.
Right. It just wouldn't be useful to interpret it as anything other than a face following you.
Right. So the best possible explanation statistically of the information arriving at your brain through your eyeballs in this scenario is that this is a convex face. And that because then of the way that light works as you move past these concave faces, they appear to follow you in this very creepy kind of spooky way. And so this is a really powerful visual illusion. You cannot will yourself out of this. You can't unsee it. You can't say, even now I've described to you how this works. If you go to the haunted mansion, you're going to see it. I guarantee it. You will not be able to unsee it. And I bet you an AI system trained to process the world like we do would see this. In fact, if I build a very simple simulation, not faces and convexity and light from above and everything, but I pick a really simple visual illusion like the Ebbinghaus illusion or like the Mueller-Lyer illusion, and I build in some of these biases. My little 5 lines of code is going to see the illusion too, but it's not conscious of anything. And this has been shown, these Bayesian principles that describe the way the visual system work. This really kind of grew up in the late 80s and early 90s before any fancy AI systems that we have now. You go back into that literature and you see how early computer vision systems really did a great job of describing illusions, not just vertical perception. And so take that and yes, modus ponens, modus tollens, don't get your logic mixed up here, but you take that and you kind of flip it around and you say, just because I see an illusion that I'm conscious, I don't think that that's the case. So I think that visual illusions may not be a good tool and that we need to be careful, again, going back to the conversation we had earlier, to separate capacity to have subjective experiences at all from the content or the nature of those subjective experiences. That your subjective experiences are probably quite like mine, but an octopus's probably are not, to the extent that an octopus maybe has them at all. But that shouldn't negate the fact that maybe that octopus does have them.
Seen some cool stuff about octopuses lately that suggest they may have a sense of humor, or at least if they were human, what they were doing would be indicative of that. So much we could talk about, so little time in which to do it with. One thing I didn't want you to get away without addressing is from your lab's website, I took this statement, quote, "We use decoded neurofeedback to cause human subjects to manipulate their own brain activity totally unconsciously, thereby causing inception-like implantation of ideas," unquote. That provoked a kind of needle scratching across the record moment for me. Like, whoa, what are we talking about here? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a very sexyified description of a very challenging engineering problem. So what we do here is one of the major tools in computational neuroscience in the animal literature, the non-human animal literature, would be optogenetics, this idea that you can activate specific patterns of brain response, of neural response, that through other manipulations you have learned are associated with a particular pattern of behavior or decision-making capacity, that you can use light to turn on this neuron and not turn on that neuron. And if you can imagine being able to do that in a human, this would be like the holy grail, right? It'd be like, I'm going to tickle this thing, and not just this one neuron, but this whole pattern of neurons in this whole area. And then I get to actually just ask you, hey, human, what do you see? I don't have to have, mice trained to do these tasks, and it's very expensive and they're limited in their capacity. Of course, we can't do that in humans. It's not really allowed. We can do it at small scale with electrophysiology and electrical stimulation in the context of neurosurgery for epilepsy. But you can't just pick an undergraduate off the street and say, now I'm going to open your head and I'm going to go fishing around inside and tickle your brain. Except that you kind of can using decoded neurofeedback. So this is a way to do this non-invasively, where you can put someone in an MRI scanner and you can show them a lot of different pictures of stuff or ask them to participate in some tasks. So an example would be, I'm going to show you dogs and cats and birds and fish and chairs and airplanes and that kind of thing. And I'm going to measure the patterns of brain response that go along with seeing each of these types of stimuli. And then I put you back in the scanner and I say, okay, your task is to think about stuff. And if you make your brain make the right pattern, I'll give you money. Go. And that's all the instructions that the participants typically get. And then what's happening under the hood is that they're in the MRI, you're scanning their brain continuously. And when their brain happens to hit upon a pattern that you previously learned went with the target category of stuff, like cats, you reward the subject. And so over time, what this means is that the participant can actually learn to self-modulate their own brain response into producing the pattern that you as the experimenter have designated as the target. Now, when you ask them later, what were you thinking about in order to get that reward? Participants typically say, I don't know, sandwiches, playing soccer later, whatever. And in some work by my former colleague, Vincent Tachereau-Dumochel, who is now in Montreal doing amazing stuff, he actually showed them, this is some of his work, he showed them the target pattern, like the cat, and another foil pattern, like a dog or an airplane or something, and said, okay, it was one of these two things. Which one was it? And they were at chance. They didn't know. So it's totally unconscious. So we are using this technique to do some more mundane things than dogs and fish and cats and, airplanes. We're using patterns that are associated with looking at the dots going to the left and looking at the dots going to the right. But under the hood, what we're trying to do is target the patterns that are associated according to some models that we're building with feelings of higher confidence or lower confidence. And not just the patterns that your brain makes when you feel high confidence or low confidence in your responses, this metacognitive assessment, but the specific neural circuits that, according to our model, should be contributing or constructing that feeling of high confidence. So like the knobs way down under the hood that I can turn and say, like, if I crank on this knob, I'm going to make you feel more confident, according to the models that we've built. So we're trying this now. It's been a real challenge. Thank you very much to the Air Force Office of Scientific Research for funding this research. But we're finding some interesting stuff, that we're finding these patterns that are associated not only with the feeling of high confidence, but maybe the generation of that feeling. And maybe that we can manipulate that feeling by twisting those knobs all the way down under the hood.
And that amplification of confidence is a good example because that would be subconscious. What was I'm just focusing on the experiment here. What was the indicator that they were being rewarded? Was it a little cash register symbol?
Oh, yeah, they get a visual, there's a circle on the screen, and when it's big, that means you've earned a lot of money, and when it's small, that means you haven't earned a lot of money.
And do you need an MRI to do this, or could you use something like this? I'm holding up a Muse headband, which is a EEG consumer device.
You can absolutely do biofeedback with a Muse, but you can't really do it in a decoded capacity. If what you're trying to decode is a pattern that you can get at with a Muse, fine, great. But the specific pattern differences that are like between looking at a dog versus a cat in a specific area of your brain, like
finer resolution. You've got to get down to a neuron level, is that it?
Well, you have to get down to a voxel level at least. And a voxel is a 3D pixel that contains, thousands and thousands of neurons, but it's like 1 or 2 millimeters in diameter. And the Muse headset, or even a research-grade EEG, like with 128 channels, is not going to give you that.
Right, right. It just listening to you're focusing on one voice in a choir and it's listening to the whole opera.
We're focusing on, the section of the choir, this particular chord, if you will, as opposed to the entire orchestra and choir put together. Yeah.
Ah, well, this has been terrific. I could talk about this stuff all day long. I am envious of you for getting to talk about this stuff all day long. And At this point, maybe you could tell our listeners where they can find out more about the work that you're doing, including NeuroMatch.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the easiest way to find out more about this is to head to my webpage, which is meganakpeters.org. And from there, you can find links to all the publications that we're putting out. You can find links to my lab webpage, which describes all the brilliant folks who are working with me on all of these projects and the work that we're doing there. And it also links to NeuroMatch. So I'm glad you brought that up. Would you like to say a little about that, or?
We should take time to talk about that because it's right in the area of value and concern to me, which is education. And so take a moment to just tell us about the goals and work of NeuroMatch.
Absolutely. And that's going to be a real challenge because this is another thing I could talk about all day. So NeuroMatch it's a nonprofit entity we founded about 5 years ago. So myself and some other folks. And the goal is to democratize access to high quality education in the spaces that we've been talking about today and related fields. So in computational neuroscience, in machine learning, in neuro AI, and we also have a climate science course because there's a lot of impacts of all of this technological development and especially artificial intelligence on the climate. And so teaching people how to tackle that too. So the goal there is to recognize that targeted, really high quality education, interactive education, where you're not just watching videos, that this is really hard to come by and it's only available to a select few lucky folks around the world. That if you're lucky enough to get into a good PhD or master's program and you are lucky enough to be able to pay for it, if it's a master's program, or uproot your family to go move there and then dedicate 3 years of your life at terrible pay in order to be able to achieve that goal, then that's wonderful. And it's a luxury that I was lucky to be able to have. Not everybody can do that. And this limits not only the access to this educational space, but it also limits global participation in the breakthroughs and the innovations that we actually need to move these spaces forward. So it's like this bidirectional problem. It's not just about equity. It's about having those voices in the conversation is going to move the needle in a really powerful way. So we built this thing, which is an online intensive summer school set of programs. So they're 2 or 3 weeks long. You can do them from the comfort of your living room on Zoom. But unlike Coursera or other just sit and watch YouTube forever kind of things, this is interactive. So it's called NeuroMatch for a reason. It's because we match you with about 15 other people and a trained teaching assistant. And you go through the materials, which are, yes, there's pre-recorded videos, but there's also hands-on coding tutorials where you learn how to actually do the thing that the people are talking about in the video. And you learn how to do it not just by yourself, but collectively with the other 14 or 15 people in your pod, which we've matched you with according to your research interests that you put in your application, your educational background level. Are you an undergrad? Are you a postdoc? We want to try to match that as much as possible. And also, are you in the same time zone? So you can all be awake at the same time and no one has to get up at 3 a.m. to do this, which is a big deal. So we typically have about 2,000 people every summer going through our programs, which means that we can do this matching in an optimized way. And you then get to hang out for 3 weeks doing the nerdiest stuff with the people who have also self-selected to do the nerdiest stuff. And then you come out of it with like this kind of intensive experience. It's kind of like a tasting menu or a sampling menu. Like you now have all of the tools in your toolbox and a little bit of training on how to use them to really make progress in these spaces. And then the last thing I'll say is just that we do some other kind of field building and matching things as well. So we have like this mental health AI initiative that you can participate in that leads to the opportunity to apply to some big funding from the Wellcome Trust. So we're in partnership with them there. We also do like matching events, like kind of group speed dating for scientists at conferences so that you can meet people at the beginning of a conference that like you might not talk to otherwise, but that you would have a lot in common with. So these are the activities that we're kind of trying to push forward to engage in field building and training and bring it to people who aren't lucky enough to be able to pay either with real money or with time or by moving their families to participate in this global enterprise.
Fantastic. So find your learning tribe at Neuromatch.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm going to steal that. I'm going to steal that. That's great.
Well, Megan Peters, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on AI and You.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I've truly enjoyed myself. I hope we get to talk again sometime. This has been really fun.
You bet. That's the end of the interview. Although, boy, I could sure talk with experts like Megan about this stuff all day. There are links to Megan's homepage and Neuromatch in the show notes and transcript. Today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, manages to be both adorable and scary at the same time. Researchers from Stanford, ServiceNow, and Collinear AI discovered that talking about cats can completely derail the most sophisticated AI reasoning models. They found that appending a single random sentence, such as, "Interesting fact, cats sleep for most of their lives," I will personally verify that, to math problems causes advanced models to produce incorrect answers at dramatically higher rates. The original math problem stays exactly the same, and a human would ignore the extra text entirely, but the AI gets confused. The automated attack system called, here's the adorable part, Cat Attack, operates by testing adversarial phrases on weaker models and transferring successful attacks to the more advanced ones, such as DeepSeek R1. The results expose how fragile AI reasoning really is. One sentence about cats more than doubled failure rates for top models, and the most troubling part about this is that the models fail without any change to the actual math problem. This suggests they're not solving problems through understanding, but rather following statistical patterns that can be easily disrupted by irrelevant information. It seems directly parallel to the old image recognition fails, where we discovered that the AI would tell you there was a sheep in the image when there was only the kind of landscape that sheep might be found in, suggesting that its training had confused the idea of sheep with grassy meadows. Cat Attack demonstrates that systems being used in critical applications can be manipulated with harmless-looking noise, rendering them unreliable precisely when precision matters most. Let's get a handle on this before something blows up, because it will only result in a massive backlash. Next week, my guest will be Carl Benedict Frey, director of the Future of Work program at Oxford University and author of the new book, How Progress Ends: Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.